Okay, we're recording. So we're going to pick up where we left off with Republic Book 4. So essentially, where we left off was essentially a completion of a description of the role of the Guardians as far as their assignment, you could say, to prevent the austerity and decadence of the society. Essentially, they're there to maintain a balance between those two, not just in terms of the wealth and excess side of the equation, the economic side of the equation, but in terms of what you can call the ambitions of the state as they relate to interactions with other cities. And so now we essentially have a city that's established, and the conversation now pivots to the main point of the conversation as it started, which is now the charge is to find justice in this city, which under the assumptions and the stipulations that they were made since the beginning of the conversation is purportedly a good city, or what you could call a virtuous city. And so
I think that's the main point. The city that we just formed is a good city. And because it's a good city, it should have inside of it the virtues.
Right, the four virtues that we talk about. And so we should, I guess, review the four virtues, which would be wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And here there's an interesting part of the conversation where Socrates says, well, what we can do then, since justice is really kind of a nebulous concept, to the point where it triggered this big, long exposition to begin with, this exploration, this search for justice, let's start with the virtues that are probably lower hanging fruit. So he almost wants to identify justice by elimination. So since it's a good city, it's a virtuous city. And if it's a virtuous city, we should see observable evidence of the four virtues in this city.
Right.
And what we can do is identify three of the virtues, wisdom, courage, and temperance. And essentially whatever's left over is justice, right?
Justice, yeah.
So it's sort of like a deductive reasoning.
Right. Before we get there, though, the definition of a good city was that there is a philosopher king or ruler that rules, and that ruler is, I'm just recapping.
Right.
You know, the ruler has the gold medal. That means is perfect in every way, and then the second order is that of the guardians. They're considered to have what's called the silver medal. Now, the guardians enforce what the ruler decides, and then the masses form the bronze medal, or the third order. And across the board, the ruler, the guardians, and the workmen and the auxiliary, they all have decided that the ruler rules, the guardians enforce, and the masses follow. Now again, the perfect city is the perfect city of the mind, right? We have to, again, I keep going back to that because all the points that we're going to make again now, folks are going to say, well, you know, this is authoritarian, you know, this is a dictatorship, or, you know, oligarchy. That's not what we're talking about here. This is all going on inside of our mind, where the ruler is the rational principle, you know, the guardians is the will, and then their lower order thoughts that form our day-to-day functions. And so a good city has a ruler, a guardian class, and then the working class, and all of them together understand their roles, and that's what makes a good city. So now going back to what you're saying, I think I'm going to let you continue here about the virtues and the process of finding justice by first finding wisdom, courage, and temperance. And I think there's a reason why the conversation goes this way, because justice is very hard to define.
Exactly.
And so I'm going to let you continue.
No, sure. I was just going to say, then that point is well taken, and it's probably worth reiterating almost at the beginning of every episode, which is if you look at this as some prescriptive description of the ideal state, it could very well reek of sort of an authoritarian, totalitarian system. And this is probably a side note and not one that we need to pursue much further than stating. But even in that context, assuming you have very sound principles for what right action are, even in that context, you would imagine that the individuals in this hypothetical city would be wary of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, right?
Yes.
So they would still move on because the entire organization of this city is really around the idea of right action and is really around the idea of virtue for its own sake.
Correct.
And when you have a system like that, you essentially have a system that is built on, ironically enough, and I think this is why justice is so hard, because you need sort of a regimented and almost inflexible dedication to examination, which by default is investigative, exploratory, but it's a city where the people understand that there are rulers that are in charge of deciding what is worth being accepted, what is worth being used as a foundation for making decisions in the future, and what is not. And trusting that, which that's the part where the aspect of the authoritarianism comes in, potentially. But when you realize that the other side of that trust is when you understand that the trust is deserved. Essentially, when you enter a situation where you know that the rulers have the best interests of the entire city in mind. Remember, the goal here is the happiness of the city, not just a particular class, not the rulers, not the guardians, not the workers. Now you have a situation where that trust is well founded. And to the extent that the rulers are well informed, well educated as to what is best, then that trust is, well, it's irrelevant if it's authoritarian or not, right? If you had the perfect philosopher emperor, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's authoritarianism. It doesn't matter if it's democracy. It doesn't matter if it's communism. And this is where I think I lose a lot of people when I talk about politics, because they are often hung up on the idea of, well, that's a communist idea, we should avoid that. Or that's a capitalist idea, and that's good. Or some people would say we should avoid that. But really, these political systems are tools for some larger goal, right?
Yeah.
So there's sort of a further step back that needs to be taken before you start to say one system is better than the other.
Yeah, and I think one of the features here that we have to mention is the fact that it is complex to determine this stuff at an individual level.
Right.
It is far more complex to determine
even
this at a population level. And so the approach that Plato takes to determine what is justice in a populace and then narrowing down to the individual only works in a conversation where you can apply logic and people can agree to it. If you look at the series of steps to get here, each of the statements is very logical. Unfortunately, and I shouldn't say unfortunately, the reality is that life is messy. It's not so logical. And you're not going to get yes or no answers to a lot of these questions. So, is the king a philosopher king? If there is in fact a king who's a philosopher king, that question will be answered differently by different people. And so it's so complex.
Yeah.
In this case, though, the way that question will be answered is, does the king have wisdom? Yes. Is he courageous? Yes. Is he temperate? Yes. Is he just? Yes. Well, then he's a philosopher king. But each of those things can be argued, right? There are two people on different sides of the aisle on that. So going back just to, and you can continue from here, just to say that's the reason why it's important to not read Plato's Republic as a text to how to form a republic.
Right.
Because it is very complex. Another way to look at this, the only way to look at this in my mind, is how to form the republic of our mind. My mind. When I say our, I mean many people are going to read this. It's for each one of us to determine how to order the republic inside each one of our minds. I'm being as specific.
No, I
as
agree.
I can.
And the conceit that I take from reading all this is that this is a way to make yourself a citizen of the just society, regardless of where you find yourself in your world. You can live as a citizen of the just society.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you like. This is an opportunity for each one of us to order our own republics inside of our mind. And in that case, if that were to happen, if every individual were to do that, we would live in a just society.
But the likelihood of that is we're in no danger of that happening anytime soon. But all that being said, and that's something that's the nature of virtue, which is it's worth striving for, even if it's not achievable. But
you say it right. It's an orientation. It's not a
it's
destination. You're not going to reach there. You're just going to orient yourself in that direction.
And I think they're self-aware. I mean, the self-awareness of Socrates is very apparent because he actually uses language in this dialogue that says, "Look, we're not going to try to be. This isn't like perfect. We're making presumptions and assumptions here in order to facilitate the discussion of at least getting a whiff of justice, because it's such a hard concept to describe." So, going back to the hunt for justice in this analogy of the city, so they essentially start off with wisdom. So we can look at wisdom in the city, and they say, well, the city is wise because the rulers have good judgment, and they have particular knowledge that is useful within the domain of the maintenance of good relationships within the city and among cities, with themselves embedded in a larger global community of other cities. So what he's trying to point out is that wisdom is not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but it's a particular type of knowledge, which you could call prudence, meaning having a good awareness of what it means to do things that are going to propel those under your responsibility toward a common good and avoid things that are going to impede that. Okay, so if you had perfect knowledge, that's exactly what you would do. And that's what wisdom is. And so
I want to, maybe you'll come to that. So you
go ahead,
continue.
What are you going to say?
Okay, so yes, so prudence is a great term to use here, and that's the term that's in the Republic. Prudence gets a bad name. I think it's one of there are other virtues that...
But we'll reclaim it. Yeah, it's a good word, and I think it's something that we need to redefine and reclaim.
Right, and the way when he talks about prudence, he's talking about practical wisdom. Right, because wisdom comes in two forms, according to this, according to the Republic, or according to Plato, a speculative wisdom and then a practical wisdom. Right, and the prudence is practical wisdom, and practical wisdom is something that one accumulates over time. It is by coming up against the problems of life and then coming up with a potential solution based on one's knowledge and experience till that point, and then seeing how it plays out, and then coming to understand that maybe the path or the decision that one made was not the right decision. And in the future, when one comes across the same problem, they will now choose a different path. And then by butting up against life's problems over and over again, one gains this sort of wisdom that one cannot just get by reading a text. One has to participate in life. And therein lies prudence. Now, one could say that there is prudence in the work of like metalworking and carpentry and even in the medical sciences, there is prudence. Well, is that the same prudence that they're talking about here? Well, they say no, because one could understand the prudence of carpentry. But what they're talking about here is the prudence of how to be a virtuous person. That prudence, or how to be a just state, that prudence of how to run a state is different from that of metalworking or carpentry. And that is the kind of practical wisdom that they are talking about. They want to make a clear distinction here. What I mean to say essentially is one could understand the practical wisdom of being a physician, but one may still not be a wise person.
Exactly. What they're trying to do is, the way I think of it, is they're stratifying knowledge. And there's some knowledge that is speculative, which I would say is data, scientific data. You could call that speculative knowledge, or it's sort of in that realm. Then there's technical knowledge, knowledge that pertains to a particular craft and excellence in that craft. But notice that those two types of knowledge don't really have anything to do with the common good. They don't have anything to do with virtue. They have a lot to do with productivity. They have a lot to do with other things that may provide goods in life. But again, without direction, those species of knowledge really don't do anything in and of themselves to improve the life of the city as a whole. They have to be reined in and directed at a certain aim. And the cognitive, intellectual, or reasoning force that aims those exertions and efforts toward a noble outcome is another type of knowledge, and that is wisdom. That is prudence. That is the type of knowledge about how to maximize or how to accelerate the progress toward the larger good of the entire city.
I would the only distinction I would make here essentially is that that technical knowledge is part of practical wisdom. What I mean to say by that essentially is that that the wise man or woman understands how to use their technical knowledge to achieve a certain end. Speculative wisdom is not the same as technical wisdom. Speculative wisdom is more about speculation about into the nature of things, the nature of self. Why are we here? Who are we? That kind of discussion, which doesn't necessarily offer practical answers. I'll give you an example. If you are in an operating room and you have to make a decision about whether to clamp an artery and how to clamp it, having discussions about the nature of the universe and the nature of the self doesn't necessarily help you in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, the surgical analogy would be understanding the appropriate technique. That's one thing, but understanding when to apply it and understanding why you're applying that particular technique, that starts to creep into the prudence and practical wisdom aspect of things. That's correct. It is a spectrum, for sure.
And I think I just want to create that distinction between speculative and then practical. And within practical wisdom, there are these many different types of wisdoms.
Right.
There are many different types of knowledge within prudence, but not all of them apply to wisdom. One would not say, like the example that we gave, just because someone is an excellent physician doesn't make him a wise person. And to just to put an exclamation point on what you mentioned, which I think is a beautiful point. One could be very well versed in an art, very well versed in a science, and may apply that art and science towards devious ends. Wisdom cannot be applied towards devious ends.
Exactly.
And what that means to say essentially is that one could understand, have practical wisdom have knowledge about a certain sphere of science. A wise person would always aim toward a just end. An evil person would use the same knowledge and would go towards an unjust end. Yeah. And that's a beautiful point.
Right. And so the easy trope that you could use to help understand this concept is the idea of the evil genius, right? So the evil genius
yes,
has a lot of knowledge, but no wisdom. There's no such thing as a wise evil genius, right? There's no evil sage.
Correct.
And that's why it's important to understand the virtue of wisdom, because wisdom is embedded as a Unitarian part of this idea of virtue. It is an aim toward what is good in life, what leads to happiness in the individual and for those around you. And it is not something that has anything to do with knowledge, undirected knowledge. Wisdom has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the direction of that information and what you do with it.
And one of the things I'm thinking about as you were saying, like, wise evil genius, right? If you look at a James Bond movie, right? So the villain the maniacal, crazy, evil genius is not wise.
Right.
James Bond is not wise. But M is wise.
Right.
Right? So that's how that would go about. You see, James Bond has all the tricks. It has all the, understands how to
He has a
use,
lot of practical knowledge there.
has a lot of practical knowledge, but is not wise.
Right.
But M is wise. And so I think that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Right.
Go ahead. Great.
And so then the other thing that they point out is that it's interesting to note that so wisdom lies almost exclusively with the rulers, and there's few of them. And so they actually kind of gloss over this fact when you read the dialogue. But Socrates says, and and by the way, notice how there are few of the wise. So there are few of the gold, few of the rulers, and they're the ones who essentially contain and exercise their wisdom for the benefit of the city. So when you look at wisdom as a commodity, it is concentrated in this small, select group of individuals. And then he points that out as a particular feature of wisdom. And I'm curious to know what you think about what that means at the individual level. But what I think that means for me is that essentially guiding principles have, it's hard to say if it's an intrinsic quality or if it's something that's being superimposed by the thinker, but guiding principles have an inherent simplicity to them. It's certainly much more practical to say, these are my core values and I'm going to follow them. And it doesn't make sense to have 1,000 of them or 1,000,000 of them. That would be impractical, impossible. And it begets the question, if these are core values, then why would there be so many of them if you were walking around with 1,000 rules in life? But if you had a guiding principle that was distilled down to the most all-encompassing, simple, and most practical formulation of it, it would by necessity need to be something that is small in number.
I would look at it slightly differently.
Okay.
I'm going to try and avoid using the word essentially. Okay. Catch me using it. Stop it.
Have you been doing...
I've been saying it quite a few times. I'm trying not to say it. Okay. So
we had a problem with unpack, and now we have a problem with essentially. So these are the bronze words in our conversations.
Dumbass.
They're the highest multitude.
So when we are looking at this aspect, which I really admire the way you're coming through this. Like, I think you've made notes and you're following. This is great. I was just going from page to page. It's a key feature of the mind. This concept of having a few thoughts govern all other thoughts. Inside of our minds, there are multiple actors. There are many different Aneeshes. We are multitudinous. There are many Eddies. Infinite number. And each of them has a say. It's usually the negative ones that have more of a say than the positive ones. And that is just how human minds have developed, just evolved over time. The pessimistic ones have a bigger say than the optimistic ones. The self-doubters have a bigger say than the self, if not a face, what do you call it? The self promoters, right?
The overconfident, the self-assured.
Yeah. So now some people, it's not that everybody has that. We know that there's some folks who the optimistic voices predominate, the self-confident voices predominate. Mm-hmm. But for most of us, that is not the case. We are self-doubters, we are fearful, we are all of those. But we have these multitudinous voices. Now, amongst all of those voices, there is this one voice that is always rational. What happens is, we catch ourselves doing it too. Is this the right thing to do? But let's take a step back, let's think about it. And that voice that says that is the rational principle. It gets drowned out by all other voices. We find ourselves sometimes making the wrong decision, even though there's a voice that's saying, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. Think about it. Like, don't do it. We would still do it. Right? And later on, that small voice would say, hey, son, I told you so. I told you so. That is where guilt comes in. Because we knew what was the right thing to do, we didn't do it. Right? That's where guilt comes in. And I feel like the more we go through life, and less we listen to this rational principle, the more guilt we accumulate. There are 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds looking back at their lives and saying, man, I should just listen to what I knew what was the right thing to do. I just didn't do it. Right. And what Socrates is asking us to do is listen to the rational principle from the get-go. It is the smallest, tiniest voice in your mind right now. But with practice, if you were to form a republic where each of these other thoughts think that they are all made out of gold, they all have the right idea, they're all equally wise, when in fact they are not, right? Once they all come to understand that there is in fact a rational principle inside of your mind, and that rational principle in fact is made out of gold, and everybody else needs to just get in line and make the smallest voice the loudest. Nelson Mandela got there. Mahatma Gandhi got there. Gautam Buddha got there. There's some few people who've gotten there where their rational principle speaks the loudest. I'm nowhere close. Right. I'm troubled mind. Inside my mind there's all sorts of noises.
That makes two of us.
And therein lies that this is the concept they're trying to build from the get-go. Building the republic inside of us requires for that rational principle to speak the loudest, and everybody else just to naturally fall in line. And therein lies there is the noble lie. The noble lie is that the rational principle is the loudest. The rational principle is right. And that every subsequent thought that comes understands that it is subservient to the rational principle. Therein lies the noble lie that comes from 2 episodes ago, right? That is what, and you're right. It's not glossed over necessarily because it has been discussed before in that noble lie. I should say episode, like in the Republic, it has been addressed before that the fact that the rulers are few and the masses are many. But anyway, go ahead. That was a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. That's
I think I like that. What do you think? I like that idea. Whether you're looking at the amplitude of the volume of the voice or the fact that there's a small number of voices in the city. So the voice is quiet in the mind. The number of rulers is few in the city. I think that there is a direct parallel. But I think the question is why? Why is the nature of wisdom like that? Why is there sort of a diminutive nature to it? Why is there sort of, in terms of quantity, an exemplariness of it? It's exceptional. It's rare. And I think it has to do with the fact that simply truths have a tendency to sort of coalesce into simple concepts. And I think when you're in a situation where you're essentially, there we go. When you're in a situation where you're being bombarded, there we go.
You can use it all you want. Right. It's my problem.
It's your essentially. All right. Well, I'm going to make up for your lack of essentiallys with mine. But when you're in a situation, you're in conversation with the elements. You're in conversation with circumstance. You're in conversation with biases. You're in conversation with other individuals. You're in conversation with good outcomes in life. You're in conversation with bad outcomes, pressures, pleasures, pains, weaknesses. Those are the voices. Those are the voices of circumstance that surround you. And those are, just by their nature, multitude, complex, and distracting, essentially. There it is. Wisdom is not distracted. Wisdom has an intrinsic quality of being not distracted by any of those things. And I think that means it is a distillation of a sense that there is a right path here and it is worth pursuing for its own sake. And very often people don't follow that because their distractions lead them astray. Their guardians fall for what, the bronze level thinking is putting out there. And the reason I say they gloss over it is because in the dialogue, they say, well, isn't it interesting that wisdom has this quality of being a feature of the few and not of the many? And I think there may be some multi-level meanings here in that phrase, which is to say that, wisdom is not something that you're going to find on the street in daily conversation with people. And it's not something you're going to find in day-to-day activities. It's really something that you're going to find, hopefully, at the level of the city, in the presence of the philosopher ruler who's trying to do what's best for the city, or in the stillness of the mind when you're actually sitting and thinking about what the right decision is to make in this particular case.
I have to applaud you for bringing up why that is the case. I never thought of it that way, as to why is wisdom the feature of the few and not of the many. And when you bring it up, the thought that comes to mind, first thing that comes to mind, is the fact that wisdom is an evolved form of thinking and acting. We are rational beings. We were not always rational beings. What is the wisdom of a tiger? There is none. A tiger is a product of its appetites, its innate
drive.
That's right. Its will is contingent completely. We are unlike a tiger. For the longest time, though, as we are developing from a baby to an adult, we succumb to our appetites, and pretty much all the time. As a little baby, if you just look at little babies, little toddlers, and as they're going through their life, it is all about curtailing the appetites, curtailing our drives. That's what makes us an adult. Right? If you see an adult behaving like a child, that's what makes you believe that this person is being immature. Right? We use the word immature a lot. This person's immature.
Right.
You know, they lost their temper.
Right.
You know,
the tantrum is basically being possessed by your appetites. Right.
So it is in fact the nature of things to acquire, nature of living beings to acquire things for themselves, to take up resources. That's just appetitive, right? That's the majority of our mind. We are just lizard brains. But it is the rational element that separates us from these other living beings. And that comes the just evolutionary biology. It was the latest thing to develop. And even within humans, it is the last part of our brain to wire itself is the prefrontal cortex that actually makes us rational. And that's the reason why 30-year-olds act differently from 18-year-olds, because their prefrontal cortex is all wired up, right? So, I mean, I'm sure they didn't necessarily know about prefrontal cortex, but they make a very beautiful point. Like in the Republic, Plato makes a very beautiful point about this fact that wisdom is of the few. Because majority of the times, the voices, this multitudinous voices, are appetitive voices that are making you do things, acquire things, the car, the spouse, the job, the title, the money, the comforts. All of that is just you being an appetitive living thing. And then there's a voice inside of you that says, but wait, that is not the right thing to do. Sacrifice, struggle, be temperate. That is the right thing to do. But our appetitive voices don't listen to that. I think that is the nature of a human being. And that is what is being discussed here, right? Inside of our minds, the rational principle that says, but wait, struggle, work out even though it hurts, eat less even though you have surrounded by all of this stuff that you could eat less. It's good for you to do that. Sacrifice in relationships, sacrifice your time. Don't spend your time just watching Netflix and, whatever. These are tough things to do. Your appetitive want you to do it, but your rational principle says don't. And that voice is the smallest voice. It's the latest. That's the last one to develop.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. I think it has to do with the fact that, again, there's any number of distractions that we encounter And the irony, and perhaps it's not so ironic, is that many of those distractions, as you pointed out earlier in this discussion, are not even from the outside world. Like I think on average have about 40,000 thoughts a day. And you were pointing out the fact that most of those are negative. Most people have sort of a wired and negative bias. And that makes it even more complicated. So you're not only dealing with external distractions, but you have internal distractions. And again, I think it's impossible for me to conceive of an idea of wisdom that is convoluted and messy and distracted and disorganized. Wisdom has an organizing effect. And anything that requires organization requires some form of coalescence, needs some form of organization. And we know the most sublime form of organization is the simplest one. And so, again, I don't know that we're going to figure this out, but there's something to be said for this idea that wisdom has sort of this simplifying quality to it. And suffice it to say that it is a feature, at least in this dialogue, of the rulers, but not of the multitude that they're overseeing and guiding and protecting and making sure the happiness is being maximized. So that's a good discussion, but I don't know that we'll have to keep talking about it. We're doing this reading and discussion to hopefully find it. But suffice to say that the search, the strive for wisdom is noble in and of itself, whether you arrive there or not. But and I think Socrates is acutely aware of this fact. The more you look, the less you realize you have it.
Yeah.
And
this is not about finding wisdom, because your rational principle, whatever that exists inside of your mind, the rational principle has to understand, has to have the knowledge of the difference between good and evil.
Right.
And true knowledge is unattainable. One can never know the difference between good and evil. It is a pursuit. Wisdom is the way to act in this world despite having complete knowledge of what is good and what's evil. And it is, by definition, something that is unattainable. You could probably get very close, but you cannot completely achieve it. But going back to what you're saying and going back to the text here, that what is wisdom? Wisdom is that knowledge of the self and its relationship to others.
All right.
Here he says city and its relation to other cities, but within our minds, inside the republic of our mind, it is the knowledge of the self and the self's relationships to other people. That is, in fact, that's what's wisdom. And that is what's practical wisdom.
Right.
Because that's all that matters. For you and me as rational beings, it is how do I order myself and how do I make sure that I am ordering myself to others in my society to achieve the common good.
Right.
That's what wisdom is about.
Right.
So,
practically speaking.
And that's all that matters here, right? Like Republic is in fact like a practical document. We're not talking about the nature of the self.
Sure.
What is in fact consciousness, and that is not what we're talking about here. You could maybe there is a deeper version of the Republic that talks about the nature of the self and the nature of general consciousness and the mind and how that's different from how that is forms out of general consciousness. But I have not gotten there. I've tried to look for it. I've not found that here necessarily, and I'm not necessarily going to talk about that here. But when you talk about the self, we're talking about the mind, the rational principle inside of the mind, and its relationship to other such minds outside of itself.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next part
of the discussion is
courage,
it's
right?
precise. It's right. It's the main reason why this conversation after this section goes into much deeper territory. Because I think Socrates realizes that it's really impossible to talk about the nature of justice without really getting very deep into the human psyche or soul, as he puts it. But moving on to the next virtue, They identify wisdom in the city. And again, this is through process of elimination. They're going to identify justice in the city. So they move to courage. And so the easy example of courage of the city is that of the guardians and defenders of the city. So, but interestingly here, I was expecting when I was reading this dialogue for Socrates to talk about, well, we have defenders that will undertake risks for a larger aim, and will do so in complete accordance with virtue. But instead, Socrates makes a very nuanced explanation of courage that I actually had not experienced in any other of my previous readings about courage. So he says that courage is a kind of preservation, a preservation of beliefs. And he says that courage is essentially the adherence to a guiding principle, the adherence to a rational principle despite pain, pleasures, desires, or fears. And here he moves into another very beautiful analogy about how courage can be thought of as how the process of dyeing cloth. And I thought it was brilliant. Yeah. And so, because his interlocutors don't understand, they're like, well, how is that courage? And like, you're just sticking to, you're following the rules. How is that courage? Right. And Socrates points out, well, actually, there is some courage in that, because when you look at courage as a type of fortitude in the face of adversity, but also a type of fortitude in the face of good outcomes, in the face of luxury. That is what courage is. And he describes the analogy of dye. So he says that courage is like this. You know, you have the guardians, and you can think of the guardians as being a cloth material. And so, you know, if you had cloth that wasn't well prepared and you poorly selected the material that you used to make the cloth, when you apply the dye, anything that would potentially act as a detergent will wash the color, would fade the color right out. And now you've lost the beauty of this material. It's not holding up the way you intended it to. Yeah. But he said that courage is when you essentially marry perfectly somebody's nature and prime that with good indoctrination, good education. When you apply dye to well-prepared material, that dye will not be washed out by detergents. And he, in fact, I think beautifully describes pain, pleasures, desires, and fears as powerful detergents. And you're going to experience detergents like that in life. And so what he's trying to say is that courage is a will to preserve the belief about your role. And the reason it requires courage is because it would be cowardly to some degree to run away from principle in the face of that type of adversity or in the face of that type of temptation. So interestingly, what he's doing here is he says he's talking about civil courage. And civil courage, I agree, is a type of courage. But whereas we, I think, have a tendency, or at least with my concrete level thinking, have a tendency to think of courage as something that involves physical risk, Socrates is very lucidly saying here, well, there's also a risk to something else, some other aspect of yourself, like your character. And if you abandon your principles, that is actually a form of harm. You're essentially, that cowardice will actually come back to haunt you later. And it actually takes courage to stick to the principles, to remain dyed with the indoctrination that you've been given, and not allow any of these powerful detergents to wash that color away. And he, I think, beautifully interweaves it right back to this idea of wisdom, because he says the guardians know what is to be feared and what isn't. All of a sudden, it's like, it has nothing to do with war. It has nothing to do with soldier or fighting an army that's twice your size. It has everything to do with what you should fear. You should fear losing your principles. You should fear betraying those. That's what you should fear. And that's courage, understanding that since you know what that's to be feared, you will not do that. I mean,
that's perfect. I have nothing else to add. It's perfect. That's exactly what I got from it. Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it was brilliant, I thought. So, but also, again, there was a little note there in the dialogue saying, we need to talk more about courage. And Socrates like, oh yeah, we're going to talk a lot more about courage later. And so
it comes up later on. The thing about the thing that you mentioned, which really I think it's worth repeating, is this concept of maintaining virtue despite one's appetites, despite one's fears, maintaining virtue through all of that. And that's where courage lies. You're asked to make, your rational principle asks you to make the right decision. But you're like, but there's more money to be made.
Right.
But there is more whatever, right? and sticking it out is painful. I can't stick this out anymore. It just hurts to be where I am right now. There's more money. There is more peace of mind. There is more adulation. There is more, add your, positive or your negative adjective to that. All of that's available to me. I just need to get out of this situation to go there. And what one is missing out there is the rational principle telling you, hey, there is sacrifice, there is common good, there is love, there is all that exists right now. And once you move out of this situation, all that's going to go away. And it requires courage to sit in misery because there is a greater good to be had, to sacrifice oneself for the common good, to sacrifice oneself for things that are more meaningful to oneself. The stuff that really matters in life is difficult to acquire as opposed to the easy stuff. Just simple example here would be there's a donut lying in front of you and staying away from not eating it is more difficult than eating it. There's a rational principle that tells you not to do it. Courage, this is a ridiculous example. So the courage in that situation would be not eating it, be holding on to your decision to eat healthy.
Yeah.
As opposed to courage would be a decision.
Right. Courage would be undertaking some suffering or risk for a greater good. And so
continuing to participate in that in that discomfort, when even though it is an easy alternative, just so easy to go grab the donut, so easy to change your job, so easy to change your spouse or whatever they're so easy to do. The courage is staying on and continuing to struggle. I think that's a beautiful point that you brought up.
And I think the other idea that I liked about this was the fact that they immediately went to the guardians when they were talking about the soldiers, the defenders of the city when it talked about courage. And I think that's telling, but also very obvious and unavoidable in this analogy, because the soldiers essentially are the actors. I mean, the rulers essentially outline the principle, because just as you pointed out, you come to a fork in the road in life, and then you have this voice that says, this is the right thing to do. And then the other path is, man, but this feels good, or this is much more lucrative, or this has much more pleasure involved with it. But then once you move, once you take the actual physical step toward the right path, the one that is not being driven by desires for pleasure, for greatness, for basically for base desires, and one that is essentially a path toward a larger version of yourself or for a greater good, that is an act of courage, some species of courage. And so the idea of guardians being decisions, again, comes up to the surface in my mind yet again.
Because decisions, not action.
It's the it's the act.
You're right. So it's a decision to act. So
because to think of courageous thoughts seems a little unusual to me, but courageous acts makes a lot of sense.
Correct, but I think it is the connection between the thought, this is the right thing to do, and the action that is being done. The thing that binds the two together is the guardian. The courage of the guardians binds those two together. So you have a rational thought that says, I should not eat the donut. And the act of not eating it, there is something that connects the two. And therein lies the guardians. If your guardians are weak, even though you have the rational principle of saying you shouldn't eat the donut, you will end up eating the donut because the guardians are weak.
So courage is the hands and legs of wisdom.
Courage is
it's the movement.
It is the nerve that connects from the rational principle to the hand.
Moves things from the domain of thoughts to
action. But the action has to be done by the auxiliaries, the workmen.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. If you have a scalpel in your hand, you could nick or not, but the action that is being done is governed by a thought. And what connects the two would be the domain of the guardians, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. So, okay, go ahead. That's great, man.
So then they move on to temperance. And so where courage has a lot to do with willing to risk suffering, willing to risk some form of discomfort for a greater good, temperance is more about moderation. Temperance is more about what you were talking about with the neocortex, which is like basically the avoidance of overindulgence. Meaning it's not so much that there's suffering that you're going through, but you're actually holding back on overindulgence. And so they talk about temperance as moderation, and they talk about how the city would have mastery of pleasures and desires. And there's another great discussion here. Like this book there's so many analogies in here that you could explore for
fantastic
for a long time. And so here Socrates makes a statement that the phrase self-control is actually kind of ridiculous when you think about it, because it's the self controlling the self. What is happening there? And here I think what he's doing is this, he's laying the groundwork for the next discussion that he's going to have. But he says though that when you, again, going back to your donut analogy, when you're looking at that donut and you have an appetite for it, but then you have another part of you that says don't eat it, and you decide not to eat it. Well, what was happening there? What was happening is that you had a stronger part of yourself that exerted
influence on the other parts of the self.
On the other part to suppress it, right?
And that's the many minds theory.
Right.
Going back to what you said, right? Like why is the rational principle, the wisdom, the smallest? It's the wisdom part that controls all these other parts that have an equal right, equal opportunity, I should say, to act, right?
Right.
And so that's coming back to that. The temperance, he says, is...
But temperance is when the better... it's not so much so self-control is just this idea of stronger self influencing and being, triumphing over the smaller self. But moderation,
I would put it another way. In fact, if we think about it, the stronger self is the appetitive self, the self that gives into urges.
Right.
That's the stronger self. The weaker self is the rational element. But it's the wiser self, the rational element, taking over the unwise.
Exactly. And that's where I was headed. And so he said, actually, the better way is it's the better self.
Yeah.
That when the better self is in control of the lesser self, that's when you're in temperance, right?
You're in temperance. And not only that, it is the fact that the lesser self is in unanimity with the wiser self. Even though the stronger, lesser self is larger in number than the wiser, smaller self, there's a unanimity, there's a unition between those parts. All the minds coalesce around the rational principle.
Right.
Therein lies temperance. And I was thinking of like a physical example of how that would be the case. Okay. So it's difficult, and the example might seem pithy, but one could be multitudinous in one's expression as a father, as a husband, as someone who exercises, as someone who participates in other hobbies, as someone who works, as a boss, right? And so all of these are many minds that one has, and one can go to extremes as a father and neglect aspects as a boss, or aspects as their hobbies, aspects on their social interactions or the participation in the common good. Or one could be a boss or a worker and excel in those aspects, and then these other aspects kind of get neglected, correct? As opposed to each of these not going to an extreme. I've said this before, average
at everything.
And that's very difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
Therein lies temperance. Because wisdom would say, the rational principle would say that let's focus on the common good. But if you were to focus on the common good and let go of the fact that you're a father, let go of the fact that you need to work to get a salary to support your family, let go of your hobbies, let go of your health, all to participate in the common good, that's terrible too.
Right. But it all cancels out, because following this analogy of the person who abandons their responsibilities to go, do, very noble work with MSF. But the thing is that they eventually burn out. They can't maintain that, because what eventually will happen is that these responsibilities will catch up with them, for example. And so then now they weren't able to provide a sustainable contribution to the larger aim that they were. So temperance is all about essentially nothing over much.
Correct. And the unison between this rational principle and every other principles that exist. There's a unison that says,
Right.
okay, we are not going to really sway too much away from this center point. We're going to achieve all of this together. And therein lies temperance. And that's the closest that I could get.
Temperance I mean, the idea of virtue is fascinating in and of itself, but temperance to me is sort of the meta virtue, because the virtues themselves are temperate, right? Because you could look at wisdom as the midway point between frivolous knowledge and, speculative wisdom. And you could look at courage as the midway point between cowardice and rashness. And temperance is essentially that tendency toward coming toward the middle of these aspects of your life, whether it's how you handle knowledge with wisdom, how you handle risk with courage, how you handle questions about pleasure and pain with temperance. Temperance is the virtue of virtue in some ways. And I should add at this point, I mean, we've talked about these virtues in depth with previous episodes where we talk about a lot of these concepts. And so if any of you listeners want kind of deeper dives into these virtues in and of themselves, they can always go back and listen to our previous episodes on that.
That's right.
So they talk about moderation because in this city, the better rules the worse. And interestingly, again, going back to your point, Aneesh, which I totally agree with, wisdom was a feature of the rulers, courage was the feature of the guardians, but temperance was a feature of all three citizens, right? So again, I just talked about how it's the virtue of virtues, and here we go again. Across the three strata of citizens, you find that temperance must exist at all three, because the desires of the inferior many are controlled by the superior few, but the citizens all agree.
Yeah.
So it's essentially a type of harmony.
Harmony is a good way to look at it.
Right.
It pervades all thoughts.
Right.
Temperance has to exist in all thoughts. Courage doesn't need to exist in all thoughts. Wisdom doesn't need to exist in all thoughts. Temperance needs to exist across the board. That's what I had put down as well. That's perfect.
So now we've got the three virtues taken care of: wisdom, courage, and temperance. And now whatever is left must be justice.
Right.
So I'll put it to you. Do you want to jump into justice now, or should we wait for the next episode?
I do,
because that's a whole other discussion.
In true form, Socrates' true form, it's difficult to put your finger on and trap justice. Justice will keep evading you. And so it requires its own time. We have to spend time around it. And he says this here. What we have to do now is we have to kind of, like hunters, surround the forest and keep our eyes and ears open, and because justice will escape us, and we have to.
It's so elusive.
It's so elusive.
Right.
In of all of those things, wisdom, courage, temperance, it is very logical to explain it. Justice is very difficult to explain. And I think it's best to just leave it for the next episode.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
But I will end with a little teaser where Socrates says, aha, justice has been rolling around at our feet this whole time from the beginning. And we'll talk about that in the next episode.
Right. Yes.